Chapter 38. Auspicious Hall, Dorset, England, June 24th, 1889. Ghost had not dreamt in the end. As far as he could remember, he hadn't slept either, but that seemed impossible. Surely he could not have gone so long in that realm without sleep. He had spent his time there in an unending waking nightmare. A nightmare that returned every time he closed his eyes. He avoided sleep as much as he could, but what little of the man got when his body gave out from sheer exhaustion was plagued with pain. The voice of Endirion howling around him in his cell, or the immense shuffling of the being which guarded him. His warden, the monster who had tortured him, kept him alive purely for its own twisted pleasure. At least, that had been the case. He had seen only those horrible visions of the monsters who had tortured him. For the last week, however, things had been different. Since then, when he closed his eyes, he saw the woman. Perhaps saw was the wrong word. Ghost did not exactly see the red-haired woman, but he could feel her presence with him in the blank fields of his mind. He could see the flashing of her hair in the sunlight at times. He could hear fragments of her laugh in the breeze. And he could feel the pain which gripped his heart as she died. Ghost didn't know how she had died, only that she had. That he had been there as she did. Had he held her as she had bled into his clothes? That caused the dark stains in his coat, faded and worn away by his time in the end. Ghost hoped he had been with her as she passed. He tried to imagine that he had been. Sometimes he kneeled in snow or in the fields of brilliant flowers in his mind's eye. He felt overwhelming sorrow and guilt as the faceless woman drifted into death and out of his life. His friend, his only friend, gone. Except she was not his only friend. Not anymore. Ghost now found himself surrounded by friends, it seemed. Martin and Emmanuel had been nothing but kind to him. He had Jamie now, too. He saw so much of himself in Jamie, and that scared him more than he could express. They seemed so close to becoming who Ghost himself was, isolated and alone, pushed to breaking. It was a fate Ghost could not wish on anyone, especially not Jamie. Not someone so kind and with so much potential for good. Ghost owed Jamie his life, and in return he would do anything in his power to save them. Saving them meant making sure they never ended up like him. And then there was Ray. Ghost wished he had been able to save Ray too, but it was far too late for that now. Ray had already seen everything Ghost would shield him from, and perhaps even more. Ghost and Ray knew what it was like to be exposed to the horrors of Endirion in a way few others did, and in that facet of themselves they took solidarity in one another. Looking at the historian was like looking into a mirror and seeing his own internal corruption reflected back at him in Ray's scarring. Ghost felt safe around Ray. Yet at the same time he felt vulnerable. More vulnerable than he had even in the end. There he had closed himself off, but with Ray he could be open about things. He didn't need to seem strong for Ray as he did for Jamie. He was not saving Ray. More than anything, it seemed like Ray was saving him, helping save the memories of his life and who he had been before. Only now Ray was gone, searching for Jamie's mother. Ghost wondered if that was why his dream had changed again. Perhaps they hadn't changed. Not really. The dream was still the same, except now, as he looked down at the dying form in his arms, the body was not the faceless echo of the red-haired woman. Now, it was Ray's crystal blue eyes staring up at him as the life faded from it. It was Ray's hand which Ghost grasped as he cried out, squeezing it tight as it went slack in his fingers, and Ray's magenta blood seeped into Ghost's ragged clothes. He cried in these dreams. He cried when he awoke, too, jerking awake mid-sob and finding his cheeks wet with tears. Sometimes Jamie would hear him whimpering and gently wake the wanderer. Ghost was grateful when Jamie did so. It meant he didn't have to see Ray die yet again. He felt foolish having these dreams. In a strange way, he felt guilty about them too, as if he was betraying the memory of this woman who had meant so much to him. He had only had her back for a few days, was only clinging to the barest fragment of her essence, and yet here he was, replacing her in his mind. She doesn't matter, he felt like his mind was telling him. You have new friends now. Only that wasn't fair. That wasn't what he wanted. Ghost didn't want to choose between his old memories and the new ones he had created. It was unfair, even cruel, to try and force him to. He was not replacing his old best friend with a new one. He was allowed to cherish both. He had to be allowed that, at least. And yet, he was conflicted. Ghost was conflicted about so many things, it seemed. About all of these people in his mind, the woman and Jamie and Ray. He wanted to know why he envisioned Ray dying, altering his memories of the woman to see the poor man suffer. It troubled him in a way nothing had before. Or at least, he assumed nothing had. It was hard to tell which feelings were new when your memory only stretched back a few weeks. Ghost wondered if he preferred knowing nothing at all as opposed to the torture that was only knowing fragments of himself. It was while Ghost was considering this all, having just been awoken from one of these unsettling dreams by Jamie, that the pounding on the door began. Ghost jumped, scrambling out of his chair. Jamie, who had been inspecting some of Ray's latest notes on Endirian, pulled collectively from both Ghost's and Ray's hazy memories, froze where they were standing. Both of them stared out into the hall. Thunder crashed outside and rain pounded on the glass roof overhead, making the light in the room below dance as if they were submerged underwater. Could it be Ray? Ghost asked quietly. Surely Martin or Emmanuel wouldn't knock on the door to their own home, and both men were supposed to be back in London dealing with the apparent destruction of their property. Jamie shook their head. He had a key, I'm sure. Maybe he lost it, Ghost suggested. Jamie hesitated. I don't know. The knocking came again. Should we answer it? Ghost swallowed. I suppose. The two looked between each other and slowly began creeping down the hall. As they continued towards the door, the pounding getting ever faster and ever louder, they stepped closer together. Ghost moved slightly ahead, holding his arm in front of Jamie protectively as they went. It was a gesture Jamie greatly appreciated, and they stepped in tow behind Ghost. Jamie had become fond of Ghost since they had first met. It wasn't just their shared experience in the darkness and solitude, although that had certainly helped strengthen their bond. It was, well, everything about the man. He had been there when Jamie needed someone. Not to comfort them, exactly. Not to tell them that everything would be all right, but instead to guide them through the truth that things wouldn't. Ghost had not diminished Jamie's pain or tried to wash it away. They had simply held Jamie steady as the fears ran their course, at the time when no one else was able to. Ray had recovered soon enough, he supposed, but still, Jamie was too afraid to overload the fragile man with their own emotions. As much as Martin was always there for them, there was a level of professionalism the therapist brought to their conversations which Jamie struggled to move past. Ghost wasn't like that, though. He was like Ray had been to Jamie for so many years. A shoulder to cry on. A guardian, in a way. Someone who, more than anything else, was simply there. I should open it, Jamie whispered. They were at the door now, and the knocking continued. There was a shout from the other side of the door, but beyond the wood and the rain it was unrecognizable. In case it's someone we know. Ghost looked at him uncertainly. Jamie, I don't know if that's a good idea. Just trust me, okay? Jamie asked. Ghost lowered his arm wearily. Okay, he nodded. Be careful. I'm Right here. Jamie wished they could have expressed the amount of comfort Ghost's statement brought them. Instead, they simply nodded back at him and stepped towards the door. Taking a deep breath, Jamie unlocked it and opened it just enough to peer outside. Will? Jamie gasped, stepping back and letting the door swing open. Will Lowenthal stood on the doorstep of Auspicious Hall, soaked to the bone and dripping copious amounts of water into the entryway. His dark hair, its roots now faded grey, was plastered to his face, which bore a wide smile, despite the miserable conditions around them. Jamie! Will laughed, throwing himself through the doorway and embracing the assistant in a tight hug. Jamie, 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 he repeated, rocking back and forth on his feet and pulling the youth with him. Ghost moved to defend the young person from harm. However, noticing that Jamie wasn't struggling against the stranger, he backed down. Master Lowenthal, Jamie wasn't exactly sure what he was going to say. He could possibly count the number of times he'd have spoken to Will on his fingers, and despite delivering the letter to his home, the last thing Jamie expected was to have the man here, drenched from the rain and hugging him so excitably. Call me Will. Will sounded like he was about to cry. Oh, it's so good to see you, my dear child. He finally released them, and stepping back, closed the door behind himself. It's been so long since I've seen anyone, except, well, anyone. Not to mention the rain. Walking here has been a nightmare. You walked here? Jamie asked, wiping their own now wet hands on their now wetter jumper. From Oxford? Will laughed triumphantly. I got the letter from Emmanuel, and his jovial expression flickered. And, let's just say it's very nice to see a friendly face after all that's happened of late. Jamie nodded. I can certainly understand the sentiment, Will. They cleared their throat. I'm sorry there's not many here to greet you. Ray is away, as are Emmanuel and Martin. It's just Ghost and myself. They gestured to Ghost, who had been watching the interaction from against the wall. Will jumped, noticing the other man for the first time. Oh, good evening. Ghost nodded stiffly. Greetings. Will extended a hand. William Lowenthal. Ghost, Ghost said as he tentatively shook Will's hand. That's a unique name. It's the only one I have, Ghost shrugged. Will nodded. The handshake lasted a few seconds too long, and both men grew increasingly uncomfortable. What brings you to Auspicious Hall, Ghost? Will asked after a while, placing his hand in the pocket of his soaked waistcoat. Ghost gave a brief glance to Jamie, who nodded. Jamie here pulled me out of a tear in reality, where I was trapped in a hell of darkness and screaming for some time. Will blinked. Oh. He looked from Ghost to Jamie, who nodded, paling slightly. Very well then, it seems you may know more about these things than I expected. I should expect nothing less from a fellow friend of Ray. Jamie ushered them out of the entryway and towards the observatory. I'm sorry, but are you aware of what's happening of late? They asked, slightly shocked. Will ran a hand through his wet hair, slicking it down and leaving a trail of droplets as he moved his hand away. I know there are gods, beings that are beyond us. I know that many of them are dangerous and that something is harming our friends. But I never thought... He turned back to Ghost. I'm sorry, but were you implying that you were physically in another realm? Ghost nodded. Unfortunately, yes. I was trapped there for a long time, it seems. Fascinating, Will breathed. He caught himself. I apologize, that was probably quite insensitive. You said it was a hell, but I'm an explorer of sorts. To see such an alien landscape would be remarkable. Ghost's lip twitched. I suppose I never thought of it that way. His gaze shifted as hazy memories seemed to call to him from the recesses of his mind. Mud and fields and trees. I think I was something of an explorer myself, actually. You were? Jamie and Will asked at the same time. Ghost turned to the former. Yes, I think I was. I can remember paths. I think of a countryside I don't recognize. Jamie jogged ahead as they reached the observatory, and Will stopped to admire the space. The youth raced to a desk and scribbled down a few words on a scrap of paper, pinning it to the wall along a collection of similar pages, all of which catalogued Ghost's returning memories and dreams. The dreams that didn't feature Ray, of course. Ghost had yet to tell anyone about that. Will walked in a stupor through Ray's collection of chalkboards and notes. This is a lot, he chuckled. Jamie nodded. Ray has been busy. We all have, trying to understand what consumed him, what's consuming Sherbet and the others. Will shuddered. Lucinare whispered a name in the back of his mind, a dull, echoing noise like the banging of a fist on metal. Endirian, he breathed. Both Jamie and Ghost started. How do you know that? Ghost asked warily. Will turned to face the two who now stared at him fearfully. He raised his hands, reading their apprehension. Since our last meeting, Jamie, much has happened to me. Much I can't quite explain. I have interacted with these entities. Not Endirian, but another like her has been... He shuddered. Following me. Trying to warn me, I think. Jamie inched closer to the hearth, their fingers itching towards a fire poker, just in case. There are more? They asked. Will nodded. I think so. I don't know how many, but more gods than just the two of them, certainly. I've found texts, but they're difficult to translate. He moved back to studying Ray's notes. Sherbet and the others. They're possessed by her, aren't they? Endirian? Jamie nodded. Yes. And Athena? Will asked. Jimmy watched the man's shoulders tensed as he spoke their name. We don't know. How do you know she's with them, Will? The youth's fingertips touched the cold iron of the poker. Will's shoulders slacked. They destroyed my home, Jamie. Everything I owned up in smoke. I know pieces of what has transpired in my absence while I have been caught in my own madness. I had hoped to bring my findings to Ray to cure him, perhaps. But he's not here, as you said. And I don't think anything I have to say will help here with the current state of your knowledge. Jamie relaxed a little, casting a glance at Ghost. The older man spoke up. William, please, call me Will. There was a hurt in Will's voice. Of course, I'm sorry, Will. This other entity following you, is it dangerous? Will took a while to respond. I don't know, he said softly. All I know is that he wants to warn me of something. Their name is Lucinare, I think. They sent me a letter. He reached into the satchel that hung at his side and pulled out a crumpled and very wet piece of paper. I translated it a few days ago. It's a warning, I think. Ghost stepped forward and took the piece of paper. As he got closer, he noticed something in the way Will's eyes surveyed him. A wildness he recognized. He saw it in himself and in Ray, even in Jamie to a certain extent. It was a mark of eyes that had seen too much. A sharpness to the scared and unsettling gaze. A permanent fear which couldn't quite be banished. Will was telling the truth about seeing one of these gods. Not Endirian, no. Ghost could sense that difference, at least. But something just as unnatural. Will turned back to look at Ray's notes as Ghost handed the letter to Jamie. The explorer ran his fingers along the pinned-up pages, his eyes following yet another strange set of letters. It wasn't whatever Lucenari spoke in. The symbols were more angular and different from any letters he had seen. If Lucenari's language was an ancestor to modern ones, this text upon the walls which Ray had scribbled was wholly alien. "That's Athena, isn't it?" Jamie asked, gripping the letter tightly. "One wrongly taken? It must be him." Will didn't respond, and after a moment the youth continued. "What is this, Will? This talks about them dying. Will, What is this supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Will said distractedly. "I don't know what any of it means." He tapped his fingers on a page pinned to the wall. This wasn't the language Ray had been writing in. This was Lucenari's language, the one he was translating. "This passage," he said over his shoulder. "I've seen this before." Jamie didn't seem amused by the changing conversation, but Ghost stepped a little closer to the wall. "Ray remembered it," he said, "from when he was under Endyrion's control. He thought it might have been a sacred text of some kind, about the goddess." Will shook his head. No, it's not. It's not about Endyrion at all. It's not about Endyrion at all. It's about Lucenari. I've seen this in writings about him in France." Ghost made a strange face, his brow crinkling, and Jamie asked, "When did you have time to go to France?" Will ignored both of them and continued. "It's not a text. Not exactly. It's a ritual of some sorts. People would use it to channel Lucenari in a way, to speak with him, I suppose. I don't know how it worked, only that he gave answers or gifts or something. It's all very unclear." "Answers are certainly something we need right now," Ghost nodded, approaching the board beside Will. He tilted his head, trying to read the foreign words. Luxra Vossel," Will nodded. The lights around the room flared, and both Jamie and Ghost jumped. Will looked around, himself startled. "Is this here for me?" he asked the room. The lights flared brighter. "Will, what's happening?" Jamie asked, striding across the room to join the two men, pressing his back against Ghost's arm as the lights flickered and danced around them. Ghost tensed, uncomfortable at Jamie's touch but not wanting to force them away. "He's following me," Will said, allowing himself some small bit of comfort. He turned his attention away from the lights and back to the others. I should try it. This. The ritual." "What?" Ghost asked. The lights settled back to normal. "Are you insane?" "Perhaps," Will shrugged. "Like you said, it seems we all need answers." Ghost scoffed. "I've had one of these things inside my head before, William. It's agonizing. Do you understand that? And you want to do that willingly. It's madness. No, I know madness too well. It's stupidity." Will looked at Ghost, puzzled and concerned, yet touched by the stranger's concern. "He isn't like Endyrion, Ghost. I do believe Lucenari wants to help. Those things don't want anything. They just need more. I don't think they can even truly comprehend want in the way we can. It breaks you, Will, experiencing these entities. It's not worth it. Ray wouldn't stand for it." "Well, Raymond isn't here, is he?" Will asked a little more sternly. Ghost stared at him. Will stared back. Eventually, Ghost broke away to look at Jamie, who was staring up at the two men with an expression of nervous expectation. Jamie swallowed. I think it's dangerous, but we do need answers, Ghost. They adjusted their glasses. If we have a time limit, a chance Athena could die, and if Will is volunteering to try... Jamie. Ghost did not expect Jamie's disagreement to hurt them so much. What could he care if this stranger wanted to throw himself into the arms of a painful eternity? He didn't care about that. He just felt an aching sense of sadness that Jamie was prepared to ignore his warnings. I'm sorry, Ghost, I just... Jamie nudged their glasses out of the way to wipe away a tear. If this warning is about Athena, if he's going to die, we need it to move quickly. Ghost took a long moment to consider this, consider Jamie, before letting out a long, slow exhale. All right, but Jamie can't be in here. Not when it's happening. He crouched down slightly to look Jamie in the eye, placing a hand on the youth's shoulder. It was one of the few gestures of physical contact he was getting used to. I don't want to risk exposing you to this. To risk that this thing could latch onto you, Jamie. That's not your choice, Ghost. That's mine. I can... Please, Jamie. Please. If something goes wrong, Ray needs you here. Jamie nodded, failing to meet Ghost's eyes. I understand. If that's what it takes. They turned to face Will. We need to know where they are. Ask your god that, Will. Where they are and how to cure them. All of them. Will nodded. Understood, Jamie. Jamie sighed and took himself out of the room. He paused in the doorway. I'll find a spare room for Will upstairs. Set one up for him, they said quietly before closing the door. The two other men stood in the silence for a while, regarding each other carefully. Is this safe? Ghost asked. Will shook his head. I have no idea. He looked at the text Ray had written, translating it as best he could in his mind. He picked up a piece of chalk and crouched down, beginning to draw a large diamond on the wooden floor. I need some candles, 4 of them, and something to write on. There should be a new journal in my satchel if you could get it. Ghost nodded, moving around the room to gather these materials in his scarred hands. So, he said after a few minutes, returning to find Will drawing strange symbols on the floor along the lines of the diamond. You were in France? Will nodded. Yes, I went looking for ancient texts. It's a bit of a blur, really. I was somewhat incapacitated after I first saw Lucinare. Or, I don't know if it was really him exactly, but I saw... Yes, I was in France. Ghost nodded, placing the candles where Will directed him to. I remember France, I think. I don't remember much from my time before Endirion, but I remember fields and flowers and some distant voices. I think they were in France. Will paused, looking up at Ghost. It must be hard to have forgotten so much. Ghost shrugged. Actually, it's the remembering that hurts the most, I think. If I remembered nothing, I would miss nothing. But instead, I only have glimpses, and I miss so much. So many things I've seen and memories I've lost. I think I miss France, for a start. Will nodded, sitting himself down in the center of the diamond, surrounded by intricate shapes and patterns and letters. I don't remember much of France either, despite how often I've been. Maybe someday we could go see it together when this is all over. He smiled. Who knows? wandering the countryside might help you jog your memory a little. Ghost smiled back. He felt slightly jealous of Ray to have friends such as this, who would so readily offer to travel so far on a whim. Only it dawned on him he did not need to be jealous if there was a chance they were now his friends too. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure that would be quite the adventure." The man handed Will the notebook and a pen. "So, how exactly is this going to work?" Will set the book open in front of him. "I don't know entirely. I suppose almost like automatic writing at a seance. When I begin, I will channel Lucinare and ask him questions. Or maybe you need to ask them while I'm in a trance. I'm not sure." "Ask questions, understood." Ghost sat opposite Will outside the diamond, crossing and weaving his lanky limbs together until he was comfortable as he could be given the circumstances. "And if something goes wrong, I need you to get me out," Will breathed. Ghost stared back. "How the hell do I do that?" Will shrugged. "I don't know, break the diamond, blow out the candles, move me out of the space, maybe throw salt or maybe iron shavings at me." "Salt? I don't know, it's what they use in fairy stories," Will muttered. "Against ghosts and demons and the like. I can't say I know much about this. If only Ray or Haley was here." Ghost took a deep breath, himself wishing that Ray could be here with them. "Well, I don't have any iron shavings on me, so I guess I'll have to try the other options, if need be." Will nodded at him. "All right, I'm ready." Ghost gave him a final nod of encouragement, and Will closed his eyes. The cartographer began chanting to himself. The candles positioned on the corners of the diamond began to flicker and grow gradually brighter. Slowly, the explorer reached out his hand down to the page of the notebook, gripping the pen tightly as he chanted, and on top of the page he wrote in slow, cautious letters, "Luxra Dorset." The moment Will's pen lifted from the paper, the candles exploded in a wave of brightness and a gust of air. Ghost was sent toppling backwards by the force of the blast. He could hear the sound of deafening, rushing winds, yet when he pulled himself back up to look at Will, the candle's flames were impossibly steady. Not only that, they had grown into towering pillars of flame which stretched into the air around Will, forming a flaming cage of stark white brightness around the explorer. Will's hand scratched violently at the page, the ink smudging and scratching and shifting on the paper. The chalk on the floor seemed to glow white against the dark wood, sapping the world around them of colour and casting the observatory in a monochrome display of greys and whites. There was no colour anymore, only light, shielding them from a world of darkness. Will's hair billowed around him as if he was underwater, stretching out the air in eager, grasping strands. The symbols drawn onto the floor began to lift, peeling themselves up from the ground and drifting in lazy arcs around Will as his body shuddered, and his chanting cut off abruptly in a wheezing gasp. His eyes flew open. Only they were not Will's eyes. These eyes were the silver of freshly minted coins, shining brilliantly in the light. There were infinite pools of mercury glistening beyond the surface of reality, as if at any moment the surface tension would break and the grey would spill out into the world. The silver eyes bore into Ghost. Ghost felt a wave of nausea wash through him, and he crumpled over forwards, his arms wrapping desperately at his stomach to try and settle the crashing tides inside of himself. It took all that he had not to throw up what little food he had in his system. He heard sickening pops and wet cracks as Will's bones shifted beneath his skin, his fingers wrapping in a twisted grip on the pen and his shoulders hunching and protruding against his shirt, every stretched muscle and displaced bone visible beneath the wet clothing which pressed to Will's skin. Ghost felt his eyes watering as he looked up into the gaze of those silver eyes. "Lucinare," Ghost rasped. "Yeah." It was almost Will's voice that spoke as he nodded. It echoed around the room, a reverberation which shook the floors and made the floating symbols quiver in the air. Yet there was something else in Will's voice, hiding beneath his tones, nestling in his speech. Something wrong. Ghost forced himself up into a kneeling position. "Will said I should ask you questions." "Yeah," the thing inside Will nodded, and then paused for a second. "Yes," it said, pained by the unfamiliar word. Ghost nodded, blinking tears away from his eyes. Are you hurting him?" This was not one of the questions Ghost had been told to ask. He didn't know how many questions he would get, or if this was worth asking in the scheme of things, but he needed to know. He couldn't let someone else be hurt by these entities. Not when he felt every shift and crack in Will's body, every twisting and burrowing scar left under his own flesh where Endyrion's mold had failed to take root. The thing inside Will's head jerked sideways, and Ghost heard a pop from his neck. "He is in pain. I do not want to hurt. Quickly, speak." Ghost nodded, satisfied as well as he could be. "Where are their friends?" he swallowed. "We need to know that." Will's body shuddered. "No, there." He sucked in another long, wheezing breath. "Not... no, there. But you're a god. You're one of these twisted fucking beings. Just tell me." Speaking English seemed only to cause both Will and Lucinare more pain, but it tried again. "I do not know. Quickly." Ghost looked around at Ray's notes, which flapped aggressively in impossibly strong wind which still howled around him, yet still failed to touch the candle flames or Will sitting within them. "The cure?" Ghost asked desperately. His mouth felt dry, and his head was pounding every second in the entity's presence, sapping him of what little constitution he possessed. "Do you know about the cure? What do we need to do to help them?" The thing inside Will nodded. It tried to smile, and the attempt was painful and horrific to witness. "So..." Lucinare or Will, Ghost wasn't sure anymore, grunted. "Indire sol domile amitieni." Connections, bonds, strong. The bull speaks true. Will screamed, unleashing a multitude of sounds no human being should ever have heard, let alone made. His body doubled over within the diamond, and Will's hand dragged off the page in a jagged slash of ink. The screeching, rasping sound of the screen made Ghost's ears ring, and he did everything he could to keep his eyes open, fighting against the unconsciousness which pressed at the edges of his mind. Lightning crackled around them from unseen clouds, filling the space with raging, sharp light. "Est liebte," the being rasped. "Est liebte." "What does that mean?" Ghost shouted over the noise. Will screamed again, and this time it was Will. It was a deeply human, agonizing scream. Ghost watched in horror as Will's hair, once dark, was leached of its colour, the shade dragged out into the air around it, pulled outwards from its roots in a wave of spreading brightness, adding to the encroaching shadows around them and leaving only a curtain of blanched white behind. Will's body shuddered and spasmed, his flesh twitched and writhed on his bones. Ghost forced himself up and threw his weight across the edge of the diamond, crashing into Will. The two men went sprawling across the wooden floor. The candles were extinguished immediately, trailing great plumes of smoke into the air. Ghost sucked in breaths which burned his lungs and reeked of ozone. He felt lightheaded as he rolled away to catch his breath. He saw Will twitching in the corner of his eye, frothy spittle coating the other man's mouth. Ghost dragged himself up as he heard the explorer's bones click beneath his muscles, desperately snapping back into place. Will? Will dragged in a long, gasping breath, choking past the saliva flooding his mouth. He finally calmed into a gentle shivering as Ghost propped himself up on all fours and crawled to his side. There were Will's eyes again, which stared up at him, an emerald green. They were wide, staring at the ceiling, and Ghost saw that the wild sharpness in that gaze had increased. The fear had increased. The book, Will coughed, allowing Ghost to help him into a sitting position. What? Ghost squeezed his eyes shut as the colour flooded back into his vision, assaulting his view of the world. He opened them to find Will slumping forward to reach for the notebook, several pages of which had been filled with scratchy, almost childlike handwriting. The answers are in this book, Will breathed, slumping back beside Ghost. That's what he said, I think. Will noticed for the first time the strands of his long, now snow-white hair hanging in front of his face, and he ran his fingers through it tentatively, inspecting the physical change which had befallen him. Bonds, Ghost said quietly, watching as Will began to rock back and forth ever so gently, clutching the notebook to his chest. Lucinari said that the cure was bonds? And something about a bull. What does that mean? Will shook his head. It was a small motion, and yet it seemed to hurt him greatly. His mind felt as if it had been torn in half and stitched back together again, only now to be torn apart once more. It comforted him to know there was a bed waiting for him somewhere in the house. It would be nice to rest in a bed, if Lucinare allowed him to rest. I don't know, Will said softly, but it's a start for Ray. He shivered. Ghost closed his eyes as he lay back on the floor and let his stomach settle. They should have gotten more, he thought distantly. More than just a start, they should have gotten an end. A cure for this sickness, a way to free themselves from Adirian. They should have gotten something more for what they had done. He didn't voice these thoughts. Yes, he sighed sadly. It's a start.